Here is a contradiction that should not exist. A man in Istanbul speaks a language born 4,000 kilometers away, on the cold grasslands of Mongolia and southern Siberia. Every grammar rule in his mouth, the deep bones of his vocabulary, the way his sentences stack, all of it traces back to Central Asia, to the Turkic peoples who once rode across the top of the world. By his language, he is a cousin of the Kazakh, the Uyghur, the Yakut of the frozen north. Now test his blood. By his DNA, that same man is almost none of those things. Compare his genome to the Mongolians his language came from, and the match is faint. A rumor, not a relationship. Compare him instead to a Greek across the Aegean, an Armenian in the Caucasus, a farmer whose ancestors worked the soil of Anatolia 8,000 years ago, and suddenly the genome lights up. That is where he belongs. That is his family. So which is he? The language says Central Asia. The blood says the Aegean. They cannot both be the homeland. One of them is lying, or rather, one of them is telling a truth we've been reading wrong for a very long time. When scientists ran this comparison at scale, Turkish genomes against every major population in Asia and around it, the results, on the surface, made no sense. A people named for the East who are genetically anchored in the West. And solving that contradiction turns out to be one of the most revealing detective stories in human genetics. Because the answer doesn't just explain the Turks. It exposes something most people get completely wrong about how peoples are made. Let's work the case. Every good investigation starts by laying out the evidence exactly as it is, without forcing it to agree. Evidence number 1, the language. This part isn't in doubt. Turkish is a Turkic language, full stop. Its closest living relatives are spoken in Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, out toward the Altai Mountains where Mongolia, Russia, and China meet. That is the linguistic homeland of the entire Turkic family, and no serious person disputes it. If language were ancestry, the Turks of Turkey would be a Central Asian people who simply moved west. Evidence number 2, the history. Also not in doubt. Just under 1,000 years ago, in the 11th century, Turkic-speaking horsemen, the Seljuks, pushed out of Central Asia, won a decisive battle at Manzikert in 1071, and cracked Anatolia open. Centuries later, the Ottomans finished the job. Over roughly 900 years, the peninsula we now call Turkey went from speaking Greek, Armenian, and other Anatolian tongues to speaking Turkish. That's a real conquest. That's a real language replacement. The map genuinely changed. Evidence number 3, the blood. And this is where the case gets strange. When you sequence modern Anatolian Turks and ask what they're actually made of, the Central Asian East Eurasian component, the genetic signature of those conquering horsemen, comes out small, depending on the study and the region, somewhere in the range of roughly 9 to 15%. The rest, the overwhelming majority of the genome, is local: Anatolian, Aegean, Caucasian, Levantine. The ancient farmers of Anatolia, the Byzantine population that was already there, the deep, layered West Eurasian ancestry of the Eastern Mediterranean. So look at what we have: a total language change, a famous, well-documented conquest, and a genome that barely moved. Those 3 facts should not fit together. A conquest that rewrote the language should have rewritten the blood. It didn't. That's the contradiction. That's the thing that makes no sense. Unless you understand the single most misunderstood force in human history. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You'll start noticing it everywhere. Here is the resolution. The thing that dissolves the paradox has a dry academic name: elite dominance language shift. But the reality of it is anything but dry. Picture Anatolia after Manzikert. Millions of people already live there: farmers, townsfolk, whole cities, a population with roots going back to the first agriculture on Earth. Into that world comes a new ruling layer: Turkic-speaking warriors, then Turkic-speaking administrators, then a Turkic-speaking court and army and tax system. They are the power, they are the prestige. Their language is the language of advancement, of the state, of belonging to the winning side. And here is what actually happens over the generations. The existing population does not get replaced. It gets converted. People adopt the language of power because their children's futures run through it. A family that spoke Greek in 1071 speaks a little Turkish by 1200, mostly Turkish by 1400, and only Turkish by 1600. And across all those centuries, they are marrying their neighbors. the same local families who were always there. The language pours in from the outside. The bloodline stays home. That's why the genome barely moved while the language moved completely. You do not need to replace a people to replace their words. You only need to hold power long enough that speaking the old tongue stops paying. The Turks of Turkey are, in the main, the same ancient Anatolian population that was always there, Byzantines if you like, and before them the peoples of the Bronze Age, and before them the very first farmers, wearing a Central Asian language like a coat handed to them by their rulers. Now go back and reread the evidence. Nothing contradicts anymore. The language points to Central Asia because that's where the coat was made. The blood points to Anatolia because that's who put it on. The 9 to 15% Eastern signal? That's the horseman, real, present, traceable, but a topping, not the cake. The conquest was linguistic and political. It was never, mostly, genetic. Case, on the surface, solved. Except a good detective knows the surface solution is where the real questions begin. If this is the kind of thing that rewires how you look at history, the moment where the obvious story and the true story split apart, subscribe, not for the algorithm. Because every people has a coat and a bloodline, and once you know to look for the seam between them, you're going to want to see the next one pulled apart. Now, the harder questions. Because elite dominance is the answer, but it opens 3 doors, and a real investigation walks through all of them. Door 1. If the blood is mostly Anatolian, then who were the ancient Anatolians? And the answer stretches the story back far past any Turk or Byzantine. Anatolia is one of the founding grounds of the modern human world. The first farmers there, 9,000 years ago, were so important that they became one of the core ancestral ingredients of all of Europe. When Europeans get told they carry early Anatolian farmer ancestry, that's this same population. So the Turkish genome isn't just not Central Asian, it's sitting on top of one of the deepest, most consequential ancestral sources in all of West Eurasia. The horsemen arrived 1,000 years ago. The foundation is 10 times older. Door 2. Does the Eastern signal spread evenly, or does it hide in patterns? And here the DNA gets almost novelistic. That Central Asian component isn't smeared uniformly across the country. It tends to run a little higher in certain eastern and interior populations, a little lower toward the Aegean coast, a faint geographic memory of how the newcomers actually settled and spread. The genome remembers not just that the horsemen came, but roughly which way they flowed. You can read migration in the gradient. Door 3, and this is the one that should humble everyone, how many other peoples are wearing a coat we've mistaken for their skin? Because if a total language shift can happen with barely any genetic replacement in Anatolia, then language and ancestry are not the same thing anywhere, and we've been sloppily treating them as one for centuries. Hungarians speak a language from the Ural Mountains but are genetically European. Much of Latin America speaks the languages of Iberia over deep indigenous and African ancestry. The Turkish case isn't an exception to how peoples form. It might be the clearest window we have into the rule. So let's deliver the verdict. The results made no sense only because we walked in with a false assumption that a people's language is a receipt for their ancestry. It isn't. Language is the easiest thing about a people to change and the loudest thing to notice, which is exactly why we keep mistaking it for the deepest thing. The Turks of Turkey speak a Central Asian language and carry a West Eurasian, overwhelmingly Anatolian genome, and both of those facts are completely true at the same time, and there is no contradiction. There was only a bad assumption wearing the disguise of common sense. And when you strip that assumption away, the real portrait is more interesting than either simple story. Not conquerors from the steppe who overran a land. Not a pure ancient people untouched by anyone. Instead, one of the oldest continuously inhabited populations on the planet. The deep Anatolian bedrock, layered with Caucasus and Levantine and Aegean threads, and then handed a new language by a horseback aristocracy who left more words behind than genes. A blood that stayed, a tongue that traveled, a people who are, in the most literal sense, both the conquered and the name of the conquerors, at the same time. That's the thing about DNA. It doesn't argue with your language, your flag, or your history books. It just quietly separates what you inherited from what you were handed, and shows you they were never the same thing. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.